Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Missouri Department of Conservation's Wild Webcast on Weird Wildlife. I'm Joe Jarek with the department's Outreach and Education Division, and I'll be hosting today's webcast. We're joined by our two guest experts. We have MDC wildlife biologist Aaron Schenk and MDC fisheries management biologist Darby Neiswanger. Welcome, Aaron and Darby.
Thanks for having us, Joe.
Well, let's get to know them a bit better. So, Aaron, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, I have a Master's of Science degree in wildlife conservation from the University of Minnesota at Twin Cities. And I've been with Missouri Department of Conservation for 16 years now as the urban wildlife biologist at our Powder Valley Conservation Nature Center, which is in St. Louis. I'm especially excited to be involved lately in native bee monitoring and conservation efforts. And I enjoy working with a wide variety of partners on urban habitat improvement projects. Outside of work, my husband and my kids keep me busy hiking and biking and swimming with my family. And I also enjoy gardening, reading, and coaching softball.
And from the picture that we have of you, Darby, this is one of your kids?
Yes, that's one of my sons helping band some Canada geese.
All right, well, thank you. And Darby, tell us about yourself.
Sure, yeah. I've been working with MDC and mostly with fish since 2004. My first job while I was still a college student was really cool. It was snorkeling in Ozark Stream, searching for the endangered fish called a Niangua darter. So since then, I just have been hooked on working with water and cool creatures that live within the water. I've worked with bull trout and coho salmon in Oregon. I've worked with grotto sculpin in southeast Missouri, pallid sturgeon in the Missouri River, and a lot more species. My love of all things outdoors came from a childhood spent camping, fishing, and hiking, and I went to school at Northwest Missouri State University and got my degree there in wildlife ecology and conservation. And then I went on to get my master's degree from SEMO, from Southeast Missouri State University. Like Joe said, I am currently a fisheries management biologist, and I work out of the Columbia office. I've been there since 2016.
Well, thank you, Darby. And folks, we have a lot to cover today, so if you go a little long, stick with us if you can. Missouri has some pretty weird wildlife. So, Aaron, you'll be sharing your top 10 land animal oddities.
That's right.
And then, Darby, you'll be sharing your top 10 weird water animals. And we have a couple honorable mentions also. So for our audience, please share your questions through the chat box on the right side of your webcast screen. We'll answer what we can in the time we have. So let's get started. Aaron, number 10.
All right, starting it off with the flying squirrel. I want you to imagine for a second that you have a flap of skin that stretches from your neck to your wrist and all the way down to your ankles, and that's what it's like to be a flying squirrel. They use this flap of skin to glide up to 150 feet from one tree to another. When they land on another tree, they typically will scamper to the other side very quickly, just in case any predators may have seen them land. They're also really interesting squirrels because they eat more meat than we tend to think of with squirrels.
And they look so cute.
They are so cute, but believe it or not, they're rather carnivorous. And it's interesting too, if you've ever seen base jumpers or skydivers with their special suits, they're really trying to mimic the ability of that flying squirrel to glide through the air.
Yeah, I was just watching How to Train Your Dragons 3 last night, and they
there
use
you go.
that.
That's
So
right.
yeah.
Exactly.
All right. And Darby, number 10.
Number 10 is a bryozoan. So this is actually microscopic animals that are similar to like a coral, like the microscopic animals that make up coral, but they form these huge jelly-like masses that can be as big as a basketball.
So there's like tens of thousands of them.
Yeah, exactly. And so we see these floating in water, sometimes attached to twigs or things in water, and they look really gross and kind of, you wouldn't want to touch them because they're slimy, but actually they indicate really good water quality. So they can form in the spring, and then usually they die off in the colder weather winter months, and they're found statewide.
All right, and yeah, folks, we try to have our maps on every one of these so you can see where you can find them in Missouri, and yeah, as big as a basketball sometimes. Wow. All right, and Darby, number 9.
Number 9 weird wildlife is the Ozark cavefish. This is a colorless, transparent fish. It lives in complete darkness in caves, so no need to have color, no need to have eyesight. It does not even have eyes. You can actually see its heart beating through its skin. It lays eggs, about 20 eggs, and then it collects those eggs in its mouth and kind of holds those eggs in its gills for a period of time, 4 to 5 months before they hatch.
4 to 5 months.
Yeah,
That's
so
a long
right,
time.
yeah, holding them in their gills. And these fish are found only in Southwest Missouri, in caves in Southwest Missouri.
All right. Moving on. Erin, your number 9.
My number 9 is the eastern hognose snake. There's a couple reasons why this one is weird, including that it has a very wide range of coloring from black to brown to greenish, yellow, orange. It's found statewide, and we get a lot of questions about this particular snake at nature centers and visitor centers around the state because one of its defensive mechanisms, if you approach it or it are frightened in any way, is for it to flatten its head and try to look as deadly and dangerous as it possibly can, which it is not deadly or dangerous. This is a non-venomous snake, but it tries to make itself look like a cobra. And then if that fails, it will flip itself upside down and play dead. And sometimes even release its feces to try to get you to leave it alone.
So it'll smell dead too.
That's
and
right.
If we look at the pictures, there's a orange version with its head flattened like you were mentioning, and the two center ones.
And then down bottom right is a very different looking one. It's the same species though, eastern hognose snake.
Okay, so variety of color. Fascinating again. And Erin, while you're at it, number 8.
Number 8 is the leafcutter bee. The leafcutter bee is known for using its mouth parts to cut small pieces of leaves in order to line their nests with those leaves. They are not a social bee, they're solitary, so they don't have hives, they just have individual nests. And you can see in the pictures here, at the top left, you can see some leaves that have been trimmed by a leafcutter bee. And then at the bottom center picture, those are the encasings that the bee will, and each individual each individual casing will have one egg in it for one bee that they will provision with nectar and pollen. And another interesting thing about these bees is that they will lay the female eggs, which are fertilized eggs, in the back of the nest, and the males up front, because the males, the eggs that are up front are more susceptible or vulnerable to predation or scavengers. And so they want to protect those female bees in the back.
That are going to be reproducing and adding more generations, kind of keeping them safer.
Yep. And another interesting thing with bees in general, the male bees being from unfertilized eggs means that they have a grandfather but no father.
Well, that's pretty weird in itself.
Weird.
And you mentioned with them too, they're solitary. So folks, you could put like bee houses in the lower left that we see to attract these and other kinds of bees. And then that center picture, that's one dug in a log.
That's a kind of a cross section of what it would look like inside that nest. But you can provide nesting through very small cavities in your own yard. In fact, just drilling some holes in some old firewood that you're not going to use over the winter can provide good nesting space for these kinds of bees.
All right. Again, fascinating. You wouldn't think that bees would be cutting leaves and things like that.
I know you would. Yes, you wouldn't think that kind of leaf structure would result from
a bee.
Yeah.
Right. Fascinating. All right, over to Darby now. Number 8.
Number 8 is our only invasive species on the list. It is the silver carp, and it's actually originally from Eastern Asia. So it is not native to America. I think the weirdest thing, and most people will see those carp jumping out of the water. They jump in response to any sort of vibration, and it's thought that they do that just to evade predators, to get out of the way of something that's going to eat it.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
So a 45-pound fish jumping out of the water into your boat and right at your face is not a good thing. So they do eat plankton, so they can get really large, as you see in the bottom right picture, but they eat really small microscopic plants and animals. They have very few predators because they are an invasive species. And their eggs, they can lay millions of eggs in a year, and it only takes 2 days for them to hatch.
So we have a cave fish that takes months.
Exactly.
And these invasive carp that take days.
Days, yes.
And because they're plankton eaters, they kind of really clean out the body of water of food for other fish all the way up through the food chain.
Absolutely. That's the really sad thing. They're preying on the base of the food chain, which is that plankton. So not only are they harming things that also eat plankton, so things that are directly competing with it, they are also harming everything else that relies on that food chain in the river.
All right, so we don't want these in the state.
Absolutely not.
All right, and another weird fish, Darby, you're number 7.
Number 7 is a large fish. It's called the alligator gar. This is one of several species of gar we have in the state, but definitely the largest species of gar. All gar can actually breathe air. So they have evolved this ability to kind of use their swim bladder as a sort of lung. And that allows them to live in places that don't have a lot of dissolved oxygen in the water. Think those kind of stagnant backwater, wetland areas. They can get up to 350 pounds, 10 foot long. So they're kind of a southern species, and they were only recently reintroduced by the Department of Conservation back to Missouri into the southeast part of the state. They are a top level predator, but they are a native species, and we do want to emphasize that they are not a threat to humans.
Okay, I was going to say they look pretty fierce.
Right.
They don't eat.
No, they're not going to eat humans. No.
Okay,
Yes.
and especially that historical picture in the bottom center, that is from Missouri, and that shows kind of how big they got way back in the day.
Yeah, they suffered from habitat loss and pretty much extinct from the state because of the habitat loss.
All right, that is a huge fish, but again, not dangerous to us, fortunately. All right, jumping back over to Erin, you're number 7, this crazy little critter.
Yeah, the short-tailed shrew. It is a mean little booger. It can eat up to 3 times its weight in food every day, which, let's be honest, that sounds amazing. Yeah. But it's mostly eating worms and millipedes and other insects. And it's active year-round, so it has to eat more in the wintertime in order to maintain its body heat. But the really weird thing about this critter is that its spit is venomous. So unlike snakes that can inject their venom into their prey, the short-tailed shrew has to chew its venom to immobilize it. But this does allow the shrew to immobilize animals that are larger than itself, like frogs and salamanders. But again, it has to chew that venom into that critter until it's subdued.
So you mentioned it doesn't have any fangs, but if you look like the bottom couple of pictures, it does have sharp teeth.
Very sharp teeth, that's right. So in order to tear into that food source and inject its venomous spit into it.
Again, thank goodness these are tiny. A lot of folks think, moles are traditionally blind, and shrews and voles, they kind of look alike. So are these blind? That's right.
They have very small eyes, and they do not have good vision, but they're not entirely blind. You primarily find them running along the ground, but they can also climb a bit too, which is really interesting. You can very occasionally, not commonly, but occasionally find them even 2 feet up into trees pursuing insects and other food.
All right. So, and again, thank you from, I believe it's Ayla, for asking that question. All right. And Erin, while we're on the land critters, let's jump to number 6.
The American coot. The American coot has the head of a duck, the body of a chicken, and the feet of a dinosaur. And when it's swimming, it really looks more like a duck. When it's walking, it looks more like a chicken, but it isn't related to neither one of these. Really, it's more related to the rails. So sometimes people call these mud hens because you find them in wetland, marshy areas. And I tell you, if you've ever doubted the evolutionary connection between birds and dinosaurs, just check out the feet on a coot, which you can see a nice close-up shot of those feet in that upper left-hand picture. They really are remarkable.
They do look so reptilian in that.
They do. They're fairly clumsy flyers. Because their legs are set fairly far back on their body, which allows them to dive down and eat invertebrates and emerging vegetation off the floor of a water body. But that also doesn't help them in taking flight. So if you ever watch a coot try to fly, it's kind of humorous to watch them try to get in the air.
And you mentioned they kind of walk like a chicken. So the bottom left photo shows kind of where their legs are and kind of that clumsy walk. and their weird feet,
Yes,
that center bottom
they'll
picture.
use their feet to fight each other and to kind of demonstrate their dominance over each other as well.
And another interesting thing, they have their nests floating
They do.
out on open water.
They're very good engineers. They're kind of known for their nest construction and how they're able to build their nests right there floating on the water surface. Mm-hmm.
Weird, weird wildlife indeed. All right, so let's jump back over to Darby with your number 6.
Number 6 is the paddlefish, also called the spoonbill. It's a really popular sport fish here in the state. It's distinct because of this greatly elongated paddle-like snout. The cool thing is this fish is only found here in the Mississippi Valley. The only other place in the world is in China. So that's kind of a really weird thing that it's only found in 2 places in the world. The eggs are really popularly used for caviar, and so it suffered from overfishing because caviar is expensive and makes people a lot of money. It's a really long-lived species, and it eats plankton, like we talked about the silver carp. It eats plankton. This fish can get rather large, well over 100 pounds, 150 pounds. As you can see in the upper left, that's a very large fish.
I think that's our state record.
That is the state record, yeah. And so they're also eating microscopic plants and animals. And because they eat microscopic food, you can't really put anything they would like to eat on a hook to bait them. So how anglers catch them is they snag into them with just hooks sagging into their bodies. And these fish are ancient fish. Like I said, they were swimming around at the same time the dinosaurs were on Earth. They've been here a really long time.
And again, for such a big fish to eat such microscopic, such a microscopic diet.
Kind of like whales. You think of like whales are a large marine fish that just eat microscopic plants and animals.
Right. Yes. Again, fascinating. And again, folks, please share your questions through the chat box on the right side of your webcast screen. And we have another question from Ayla. Can the American coot climb?
No, not really. They're good walkers and they can fly, but not necessarily climb with their feet. Mm-hmm.
And then Danielle wants to know, so how does the coot swim if it doesn't have webbed feet? We think ducks, geese, webbed feet.
That's right. They're not quite as good of dabblers as ducks and geese, but they do have some residual webbing or additional flesh on their feet, which does allow them to swim effectively in the water. Mm-hmm.
Okay, again, it's what the chicken duck dinosaur combo. They can't do anything incredibly well, but they do everything pretty
That's right.
well.
They do all right.
Yes, they do all right. All right. And again, thanks for your questions, folks. Keep them coming. We'll jump back to Darby with your number 5, another pretty ancient fish.
Yeah, that's right. A close relative of the paddlefish actually is the pallid sturgeon. This is a federally endangered species living in the Missouri River and some tributaries. It's a really long living fish. It can live over 40 years, 50 years. We're not really for sure how long it lives. It does, just like any other long-lived species like humans, it takes a while to mature. So it may take up to 13 years for females to be able to produce eggs and spawn. The upper left-hand picture there shows the 3 species of sturgeon we have in Missouri. So the top fish is a lake sturgeon, which is state endangered fish, and it's found in Mississippi and Missouri rivers. The middle picture, or the middle fish, I'm sorry, is a pallid sturgeon, which you can see it's lighter in color, but you can't always go by the identification. It does have a longer snout. And what I like to tell people is it has a very smooth belly, as opposed to the very similar shovel-nosed sturgeon, which is the bottom fish. The shovel-nosed has a scaled belly. It has a shorter snout. It's usually more brown or yellow in appearance. And the top middle picture shows how big these fish can get. Now that's an example of how big the pallid sturgeon can get in Montana. In Missouri, we're looking at, a 12, 14 pound pallid would be just ginormous in Missouri.
Okay, so we have 3 species in Missouri.
Right.
2 of them are endangered and protected.
Right, absolutely. So you're looking at the upper left picture again, the top 2, the lake sturgeon, the pallid sturgeon, those are endangered, so they need to be released unharmed. If you do catch one, just put them right back into the water.
All right, and the bottom one, you can't catch that.
You can't.
You know, for such a big fish too. I mean, I've seen these in our hatcheries, and when they're little, if we go back to that slide, I mean, they're kind of cute little fish when you look at it.
They're kind of cute, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. And folks, thanks for your patience. We're getting questions. Keep them coming. And Erin, we're going to jump over to you for your number 5.
Well, the 5-line skink is strange primarily because it can break its tail off in order to escape a predator. And it has cleavage points along its tail. If you think of the way paper is perforated and makes it easier to tear, that's essentially how the tail is constructed on a 5-line skink. So if a predator were to grab its tail, it can actually cleave that tail off, and the tail will continue to move to distract that predator while the rest of the animal makes its escape.
Can get away.
That's right. And then they have sphincter muscles within that tail that will cut the caudal artery off, so it won't bleed to death, essentially. So they're well adapted to making their escape this way.
That is fascinating. If we look at some of these pictures, the bottom.
There you see one right there, that bottom left. You'll notice the missing tail on that adult 5-line skink. They will grow a tail back as well, but it tends to be shorter and not as bright colored as the original, which kind of goes to show you nothing's as good as the original. But and also I want to point out that the juvenile 5-line skink looked very different than the adult. So those 2 middle pictures where you see the iridescent blue skink, that is a juvenile skink, and they won't mature for 2 to 3 years or so. But the males will not tolerate other males in their territory, and they will get very aggressive towards other males. So it's good that the juveniles look different.
Okay, and I think we mentioned the color. So again, that bottom left, that's an adult male because it has that bright orange or red.
That's right. And they especially get that bright orange head when they're breeding, and they're really active this time of year. You're very likely to see these skinks out and about in any kind of a woodland or open woodland habitat. So April to October, during the warm months of the year, you'll see these guys out and about.
Right, and I'm thinking adults, they get about 4 inches long.
Yeah, 4 to 6 inches long from head to tail.
And then again, that juvenile is just on a finger.
That's
so
right.
You see just how small.
Now I think he's
they are.
cute.
Oh, adorable! Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you. Charlotte wants to know: do we have any evidence or anything? Does it hurt when they lose their tails? How's that work?
I imagine it doesn't feel good, and it does cost them something. So it is not something that they do readily at first defense to lose their tail. It appears as though their immune systems take a hit after they lose their tail. So again, it costs them physically something to lose that tail.
Okay, and do we know, Randy wants to know, what do we know how long it takes for that tail to grow back?
It really depends on the nutrition and health of that animal, how long it can take. It can take months to a year for that tail to grow back.
Okay, and you said they live several years.
They do. In the wild, we estimate they live 5 to 6 years probably on average. And for such a small critter, they don't reproduce till 3 or 4 years, or 2 or 3 years old. So if you see these guys, show them some respect and some space, and let them go forth. And
they're amazingly fast too, so it's tough to even catch them.
They really are. You're right.
Danielle also wants to know, are they also called like the blue-tailed lizard?
It's likely that there's plenty of other names for the 5-lined skink. So around St. Louis, I don't hear it called that, but I believe that it would definitely fit the bill.
A lot of local names. Sure. And while we're with you, let's move on to your number 4, Erin.
The number 4 is the opossum, sometimes just called the possum. And the reason why this is weird is that this is North America's only marsupial.
And a marsupial is?
A marsupial is a pouched mammal, so like the kangaroo. The young are born after only about 12 days gestation, so they're the size of about a bumblebee when they're born. And then they climb up the mother's belly and into the pouch, which you can see a picture of that open pouch with some babies, some very newly born babies in that pouch. And then they'll remain in that pouch for another 10 weeks or so, nursing and growing until they're large enough to come out and hang all over their mother and drive her crazy, like you see in the top
Looks
left
like a
picture
dedicated
there.
mom there.
That's right.
Do they go, like, you know, a kangaroo Joey, the baby, will go back into the pouch as needed? Do they kind of go in?
They will come out and go back in for a brief amount of time, maybe a couple weeks, and that's when they're still weaning or nursing.
Okay.
They go into the pouch in order to nurse.
And then they get pretty big and too big for the pouch.
They do.
As mom can see there.
And another interesting thing about the possum is that it will play dead, and it's kind of famous for that. And when they play dead, they're really not pretending insofar as they basically go into a brief nervous shock where their blood pressure drops and their breathing slows, and they essentially pass out a little bit. This really hinges on for defensive purposes, this hinges on the pursuer losing interest in the animal when it thinks it's dead. But that doesn't always work out very well for the possum in the wild.
Well, and we know that we see them a lot of times as roadkill because their reaction to an oncoming car maybe to be play dead, which doesn't work.
That's right.
For that. They're also cool, just briefly, because they can hang by their tail.
They can, not for very long, but they sure can do it. Those tails are what's called prehensile or grasping, and so they'll oftentimes use those tails to hold things like nesting material as they walk along.
Fascinating, fascinating. You know, we get a lot of questions online, folks loving and hating possums, and one of the things is they eat a lot of ticks.
Yeah.
So kind of what's their value, and is it just ticks off them or around them as they kind of stumble about?
They do not have a discerning palate, so they will eat just about anything. They're omnivores. Ticks off of themselves, ticks off the ground, other kinds of insects that they find out and about, rotting fruit. They're actually very beneficial to have around that way. And another interesting point is that possums really get a bad rap because they have a face only a mother could love. But there's really very little to fear about these animals. They're primitive and they don't carry the kinds of diseases and parasites that we see in other mammals of this size. And their paws are very soft. They're somewhat like our own hands, and so they don't really dig. They don't really gnaw. They don't cause property damage that way. So really, we should all have a little more appreciation for the possum.
All right, let's show the possum some love. Thank you.
Right.
All right, and we'll jump back to you, Darby, with your number 4.
Is the American eel. So a lot of people don't think of eels in Missouri.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of like you think about a salmon, they spawn in freshwater and then move out to the ocean. Well, this is just the complete opposite. So eels spawn in the ocean. They spawn somewhere around the Bermuda Triangle. It's kind of a mystery. No human has ever observed them spawning in the wild. And it just recently, the spawning location was kind of determined. And so they spawn clear out in the ocean. And then they make these huge migrations as they get older. They start out as kind of this transparent eel called a glass eel, which you see in that person's hand in the upper left. And as they get older, they turn into a yellow color, and then they'll make their way up into freshwater. Now, males will hang out kind of in that brackish water at the mouth of rivers where the river meets an ocean. And the females will come all the way up into freshwater. And in their adult form, they're kind of this yellowish, greenish, as you see in the bottom right. And we only see females in Missouri. The males won't come up this far. And once they reach maturity and are ready to spawn, they travel 3,500 plus miles back to their spawning grounds, spawn once, and then they die, similar to salmon. So
over
really
their
weird.
lifetime, they're making like 7,000.
Absolutely.
That's a road trip.
That's a long.
I mean, 7,000. And you mentioned we haven't observed them. So
Right.
How do we track them?
So they actually, scientists track them using what they call telemetry trackers. So they're little kind of radios that they can attach to fish, or in this case, eels. And it was really hard to figure out where they spawned because it's hard to attach these things to an eel. They would bury themselves in the sand or get in cracks and crevices and knock the tracker off.
Right,
So,
and they're pretty slimy.
And they're very slimy, yes. So eels are, they can live for quite some time. They can, so they're making these long distance migrations, and that happens over the course of several years. And then they're growing as adults over the course of multiple years. And then it takes several years for them to make that migration back.
Right.
So they're somewhat of a long-lived species as well.
All right, so just kind of visually for folks, they say start out as adults in Missouri, they go down the Missouri River into the Mississippi River, they swim all the way down into the Gulf, they swim out of the Gulf out into the Bermuda
Around
Triangle.
Florida. Yep.
And so kind of as the Bermuda Triangle is a mystery, so are they.
Absolutely, yeah.
How
It's
kind of fitting.
a weird link, yeah.
All right, and thank you, Charlotte, again for your question on how old eels can live. So, okay, Darby, moving on to number 3. If we thought the American eel was slimy and weird and creepy, what's up with this?
Right, and if you thought the opossum was ugly, look at this. This is a chestnut lamprey, and we actually have 6 species of lampreys in Missouri. Only 2 species makes meal of blood. So we just have 2 parasitic lamprey species. Now, the parasite stage is only as adults. As juveniles, they actually do not need to eat blood. But they do attach, as you see in the lower left and the upper left, they attach to fish mainly, and they will feed for a period of time and then drop off. And so they're found in flowing water, and they're found, you know, in the Ozarks, the Missouri River, Mississippi River. They're really not a threat to humans. You'd have to be in the water for quite some time for them to attach to you.
Okay, so we don't really have to worry about those horrifying looking mouths latching onto us.
No, you may catch a fish with one on them though,
Okay.
which I've done several times. So.
And in the fish that they feed on, kind of like they're the vampires of the water in that sense.
Right.
Do those fish die after?
Nope. So a good parasite does not kill its host. So it only feeds for a little bit. Kind of think of it like a leech or a tick on us. So it'll fill up on blood, and then once it's full, it just falls right off.
It just falls right off. In that bottom picture, that's another one of the lamprey kind of attached to the back
the
of
head
that.
of a fish.
Yeah.
There was actually a lamprey at the Runge Nature Center in Jefferson City for a while that was attached to a crappie, and it ended up, actually, I don't think it lived for very long in the aquarium, but that was kind of a neat thing to see. They're kind of hard to keep in aquariums, is why we really don't keep those around.
Yeah, and I kind of take a deep breath looking at all these pictures. The one in the hand in the center, is that an adult? I mean, how big do these things get?
Sure, yeah. I mean, they can get, 8 to 12 inches, and they're very slippery. They're hard to keep a hold of as well.
Okay, so the lamprey, and Ayla wants to know, okay, so what kind of species is this considered? Is it an amphibian, a fish?
Thank you, Ayla. Very good question. And that's one thing I did not mention. It's actually a fish. It's you can see in the bottom center those kind of holes on the side. Those are its gills, primitive gills. Does not have the flap, the operculum that you see on most fish. And that brings up another good point, that the eel is a fish as well. And so this is even more primitive. They're a group of jawless fishes, probably one of the first fishes to ever evolve millions and millions of years ago.
Horrifying and fascinating and definitely weird, All right, well, thank you for that. Erin, let's jump back up to you over here with one of your favorites.
Number 3, the American woodcock, which sometimes people call the timber doodle.
And where's that come from?
So doodle is an old word, an old English word for foolish or silly, and it's perfect for this bird because it is a ridiculous woodland bird. And what makes it ridiculous is a few things. One, it has, as it walks along the ground, it has a strut that is a jazzy little dance it kind of does to try to activate earthworms under the ground. And then you see how it's eyes are set way back on its head, and it will plunge its bill into the ground to then grab these earthworms or millipedes or other
Bottom
things.
center,
Bottom
that
center
with an
picture.
earthworm.
Their bills are somewhat flexible too, which allows them to really plunge into that soft earth and pull out their food. But another thing that just makes them ridiculous is the courtship ritual that the males will do in order to try to win over the love of a female. And they will make whirly-gigging flights in the air and call to these females, and they will continue this behavior for months on end.
For months and months.
Sometimes we see that the females have all bred and their broods have even hatched, and you will still see these males out performing courtship rituals.
Okay, and we can see in the bottom right photo, that's kind of.
Yes, that would be about the typical flight of one of these male woodcocks performing a courtship ritual to try to attract a female.
That is wild. And the sound they make, word has it that you do a decent imitation.
Well, they make an interesting nasally like peent, 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 but then sometimes when they get flying and really excited, they can make sounds that sound really more like so they're really interesting birds to watch out there in the woods. If you can find them on the ground, they're, as you can see, especially in that bottom left photo, they're incredibly well camouflaged. So the American woodcock is really a fascinating creature.
So and also upper left we see the eggs on the nest, and then second one in is the chick hatched.
That's
and
right.
Even when they hatch right from the get-go.
Oh yeah, they're ready to go. So those young are born ready to run. They are running from the nest within hours to days of hatching, and really flying within a week or two.
All right. Again, fascinating. And again, folks, if you have any questions, please share them with us. This is some amazing stuff. Aaron, while we are on the topic of the land animal oddities, let's move on to number 2. I know another one of your favorites.
Yes. Well, you want to have nightmares? Come learn a little bit about the robber fly. We are lucky that robber flies are rarely any bigger than your thumbnail, because as you can see on their bodies, they have spikes on their legs, and on their bodies. And what they do is they use those spikes to grasp other insects, usually in flight, and then they pierce those insects with their very sharp mouth parts. They inject their digestive juices into the body of that insect, and then they suck out the insides, the liquefied insides.
Kind of like spiders do.
Oh yeah, it's just brutal. They are also somewhat legendary or notorious for their audacity, and they will attack animals larger than themselves. And this picture that you see up here on the left is a robber fly attacking and consuming a dragonfly, which is really interesting since dragonflies are known as insect predators as well. So,
right.
So yes, dragonflies are much larger than robber flies.
Yeah, just looking at that picture, 3-4 times the size of the predator robber fly, and the dragonfly who probably went out looking for a meal became a meal.
Yep, robber flies are not shy.
Right, and these two are found all throughout the state.
They are.
That bottom photo shows a robber fly feeding on a moth, and I think that might be on somebody's knuckle.
Yes, it is. It's on somebody's knuckle. So that gives you the idea of the size of the animal. And the good news is they can't do you any harm. So their digestive juices are not going to harm your body at all, even if you were to get bit. However, it will hurt. So if they land on you, we really suggest that you just brush them off. Don't try to smack them or swat at them.
Okay, shoo them away.
Shoo them away. That's right.
All right. Okay. Oh, thank you for that. And then Darby, your number 2 is another creature folks don't even think we have in Missouri.
Yeah, did anybody ever know that freshwater jellyfish existed in Missouri? These are similar to marine jellyfish that you think of, but they're really, really small. They're too tiny. They do have those stinging parts that they use to feed and to stun their prey and feed. But as you can see, they're just about the size of a penny. So they're really too small to really hurt any human. They do have 2 phases. which is this medusa phase that you see. It's the free swimming phase. And then they have a polyp phase, like a coral polyp, and they can reproduce by budding, so by cloning themselves. These fish, the jellyfish, the first time I saw them was at Table Rock Lake, and we had, it was at night, and we had a light that was shining under the water, and you could just see them swimming around.
It's kind of like, what is that?
Yeah, I had no
Those are
idea.
jellyfish.
Exactly.
All right, so we see again, they're tiny, the size of about a penny, two phases.
Yep.
The medusa is what we typically,
The
the bell
what you're gonna
shape.
see. Yeah, the polyp phase you probably would never see. They're pretty small. Yes.
And you said budding, so a sense they clone
They
themselves.
basically, like you think of like how a strawberry plant sends out runners and makes new plants. That's kind of the same as what's going on here.
That is fascinating. And folks, again, they can't hurt you. They're a little freaky to see, especially the first time. And again, those photos just show, if you're looking off the dock or into the water, what you may see.
Sure, and they are all over the state, but definitely Lake of the Ozarks, pretty popular locations. Bull Shoals Lake, Table Rock Lake, you can find them. Truman Lake, you can find them in the larger reservoirs in the state.
Okay, again, some fascinating animals. Before we move on to our number ones, we have a couple honorable mentions. And folks, again, if you have questions about these or other weird wildlife in Missouri, please share them through the chat box. So, honorable mention, Aaron, these are some land critters.
That's right. I got two honorable mentions here. The first one is the velvet ant, which isn't an ant at all. It's actually a wasp. The females do not have wings, but they have stingers, and the males do not have stingers, but they have wings. They're very conspicuous, as you can see from the picture. They're bright orange and black, and sometimes people call the velvet ant a cow killer because the sting is very painful. But the good news is it's not going to kill anyone because it's a very non-toxic sting, although it does hurt.
It's painful though, right?
Yep, and the same goes for the monkey slug caterpillar. So this is a caterpillar that will grow into a moth, and it also has spikes on its body that can deliver a sting as well. Less painful, but more irritating to people. So if you see these monkey slug caterpillars, which really don't look like anything else out in the wild, they are just bizarre looking. You don't really want to pick them up because they will probably irritate your skin.
Okay, so the message for these two animal oddities, leave them be.
Leave them be, that's right.
I mean, the velvet ant is really beautiful to look at, but leave it be. And those about the size of a bumblebee?
Yep, that's right. Both the velvet ant is about the size of a bumblebee, and the monkey slug caterpillar is going to be smaller than a monarch caterpillar, but about an inch or so, an inch to an inch and a half long.
Okay, and one thing, folks, to note too, the monkey slug caterpillar is in a family of caterpillars called slug caterpillars. So there are other ones in the state that look a lot different, but the thing is they don't look like regular caterpillars.
Yep, that's
so
right.
Again, leave them be. Watch them, but don't touch them or pick them up. All right, thank you for that. And Darby, your honorable mention.
Sure, is the Ozark hellbender. This is another species that we definitely don't want to touch or disturb in any way. It is a federally endangered species. It lives in flowing waters, streams, and rivers in the Ozark. It's a huge salamander. It can grow up to 2 feet long.
2 feet.
Yes, huge. And so you would think that these would be something that people would see often, a huge salamander like this, but people don't often see them. They're nocturnal. During the day, they're kind of holed up in these really tight spaces in the rocks, and they only come out at night really to feed. And like I said, they are endangered and they're very delicate, and we just don't want to disturb these fish at all. So if you see them, just observe and leave them alone.
And as we could see just from this one picture of them, they are so cleverly camouflaged that you're most likely never going to see one when they're right there.
Right. A lot of times people that gig will see these and make sure, and I know, make sure to avoid those because they are protected species.
Okay, and you said as an adult, they can get up to a couple feet long,
right.
18 inches, and about as big around as an adult forearm, too.
That's right. And they have these huge mouths. I mean, they'll eat crawfish and mostly crawfish, but they can go after fish and other species.
Yeah, fascinating. That is just fascinating. And both of you, very worthy honorable mentions. So thank you, Darby, and thank you, Aaron. And I have to add one more honorable mention. And it's one of my favorite odd animals in Missouri, and it's the turkey vulture. And fortunately, folks, we don't have images of this odd animal's even odder behavior. So, Aaron, why don't you tell us a bit more?
Oh, Joe, I'm glad you didn't put a picture up here of this one because turkey vultures will defecate or poop their liquid waste right on their own feet and legs to help them cool off on a hot day. And young turkey vultures, to take it even a step further, will actually vomit up their very strong stomach acid and spray it on predators that maybe threaten them or the nest. So I'm glad you didn't put a picture up there of that.
Yes. And again, folks, if you're not familiar with turkey vultures, those are the big buzzard birds with the red heads and necks.
Well, they can also have black heads as well. So we have turkey vultures with the red heads and black vultures that are entirely black.
Okay, and thank you, Jill, for your question on does that include black vultures?
That does.
So they do the same thing?
They do. Yep, they have the same types of behavior.
So when it gets real hot, they cool off that way, and if threatened,
and they will vomit when threatened.
Projectile vomiting from baby birds.
Yep.
Thank you again. Having a picture, especially for a lunchtime webcast, is pretty good. Aaron, while we have you, Meg wants to know, and Darby too, if you live in the city, what are some interesting, weird types of wildlife that folks may encounter? Anything come to mind?
A number of the species that we've gone over today can actually be found in the city. So Meg, you can look for flying squirrels, especially in older city and suburban areas. They like the older tree canopy. That's where they do best. Leafcutter bees, absolutely, you can find in the city. They do extremely well in urban environments. The possum, of course, you can find in the city. Most people are familiar with that one. You probably won't find the American woodcock in the city, but if you've got some marshy wetland areas, especially I'm from St. Louis, and being around St. Louis, you might see coots in some of the river wetland areas as well.
And fun fact too, Aaron, you're big into bees and the leafcutter bee, and being from the St. Louis area, fun fact for folks that St. Louis is home to how many different species of bees?
St. Louis is home to over 200 species of native bees. So we're really excited to have discovered that in the last 10 years, that St. Louis has such a healthy and diverse population of native bees, and that the city really plays an important role in acting as a refuge for native bees.
So folks, even if you live in the city, you can still get out and discover nature. There's all kind of stuff there for you. And Darby, Randy wants to know what type of thing is it?
It's not a fish.
The hellbender.
It's a salamander.
So the hellbenders, the
so it's
skates.
an amphibian, yes.
So salamander, it's an amphibian. Is it the largest on the continent?
I believe it's the largest on the continent. It's one of the largest in the world.
In the world.
Definitely the largest in Missouri, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, folks. Keep your questions coming. And getting back to it, let's go for our number one water and number one land weird wildlife. So Darby, share your fave.
Sure. So the number one is the horsehair worm. And many people see these in their adult phase, which you see on the screen there. They're these really thin, long worms. And they pose no threat to humans. In the adult phase, in the worm phase, they don't even eat. So they're just existing solely to reproduce and then die. However, the larval phase is parasitic. Again, no threat to humans. They're only parasitic to insects. But the larvae can actually turn their host into zombies. And that's a really, really weird thing. I think probably
so zombies are real.
Weird.
I've been saying that for years.
Absolutely, yes. So how does this work? So what happens is once a horsehair worm larvae are ingested into the host, the body of the host, say it's a cricket, the larvae bore through the gut of the host and enter the body cavity. And there, the parasite lives and absorbs nutrients and grows inside the host and grows to an adult size, like the worm we see on the screen. This may take weeks or even months to do. Some species, now not all, but some species of horsehair worm, they can chemically infect the brain of their host, compelling it to seek water, to drink, to wet, to swim, and even drown itself, because water is the perfect environment for that adult to live. So once it comes out of its host, it wants to be near water.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a look at some of these pictures a bit more. So the bottom left, that's...
So oftentimes somebody will see a horsehair worm after they've stomped on a cricket. And that's because that worm was inside the cricket growing and feeding and being a parasite, and then you killed its host, so it must come out.
Okay. And here, this is a cricket where it's compelled it to go in the water and drown, and the worm is actually emerging from
it's
that.
Made that cricket be a zombie. It can't help its actions. It's chemically compelled to seek water.
Okay, and then the other photos mostly are of kind of the adult worms. So
absolutely,
they're evidently named horsehair worms because they're about the size and length of a horsehair, a tail. Tail hair from a horse.
Tail hair. So they're really long, and even I've seen them thinking they were hair and they're moving, and so that just tells you how thin they are. The bottom center picture, that's an adult.
That's a zombie finger, isn't
that? That's a zombie finger.
Right,
absolutely.
Okay.
That's exactly what it is.
Right. Or not, actually.
That's actually an adult. It's showing that it looks like a mouth part, but like I said, they do not eat. That's just for reproduction.
That's what the tip looks like on an adult horsehair worm. Folks, that's not a zombie finger.
No, it's not. There's no zombie fingers. No.
Right.
So they can, the adults can form these really tight mating knots. So you'll see a bunch of individuals kind of clumped together. And they can lay eggs, several million eggs in strings.
Right, and those strings can be how long? 8 feet?
Really, really long, but they might be clustered up or they might be broken apart, and you can visually see those egg strings in water.
Okay, so Jill wants to know, again, how long can these things get?
It's when you would stretch one out, typically the ones that I've seen are anywhere from 12 to 20 inches. So, I mean, they may get longer, some may be shorter, but that's pretty typical size.
Okay, and she also wants to know, are they slimy?
No, not really slimy when you pick them up. I mean, honestly, they feel like if you would take a piece of hair and rub it between your fingers, they're just pretty much, kind of that thin. So you really, even if they had slime, you really wouldn't feel it. They're just so little.
No, I know. I have a much deeper appreciation, and I'm sure our listeners do, of the work you actually do, because you're just talking about picking these things up, and this is kind of part of what you do for your job.
Yes.
So how fascinating is that?
Yeah, but again, they're not harmful at all, so it's okay. Yeah.
All right. Bill asked, are they related to eels?
No, so this is actually a worm, so it's in the worm family, and eels are fish, so very different species.
Good to know. Well, thank you for sharing your number one, Darby.
You're welcome.
That's truly a number one contender there. Erin, let's jump over to you now for your number one. According to what you always say, this is just the weirdest animal ever.
Oh, so weird. Weird doesn't really cut it. Do we have a stronger word? Bizarro? I don't know. But the 9-banded armadillo, everything about it is weird. I mean, if I told you that an alien spaceship dropped these things off on Earth, you'd probably think, yeah, okay, I believe that. So these armadillos are actually mammals, and they do have some hair, some sparse hair underneath that shell encasing that just about encompasses their entire body. They're grubbing animals, so they will root along the ground looking for
diggers.
Yep, dig and burrowing kind of just under the surface to find insects to eat. One of the neatest things, and I'm so excited we have these pictures up here, those two center pictures. One of the neatest things they do is swim, and they have kind of two distinct ways that they swim. One is to inflate their lungs and hold their breath. They can hold their breath up to even 5 minutes long and float across the water. Or they can sink to the bottom like a rock and kind of walk across the bottom of a water body, which is really interesting. Another fascinating thing about armadillos is that they always give birth to identical quadruplets. So that's
So
a set of
four identical babies.
That's right. And it is just a very odd way of reproducing. They can also delay the development of the young in the uterus for up to a year if conditions
A
aren't
year?
Yep, if conditions aren't right. So they have several advantages that have, including swimming and their really interesting reproduction. And these advantages have helped them expand their range significantly.
Okay, so a lot of times we get questions from folks, are they native to Missouri?
So they're not
Tricky question.
Yeah, it is tricky. It is a tricky question. It's kind of a yes and a no answer. So no, they're not native to Missouri. However, we also don't consider them introduced because they have naturally expanded their range. But that has just happened in recent history. So 150 years ago, you really didn't see the armadillos north of the Rio Grande River. But because of large-scale landscape changes and a conversion to agriculture, they have been able to expand their range. And they're not done. It is really feasible to think that armadillos could move as far north as New York, as far west as Nebraska. So
We've seen them on the Iowa border.
You know, we have seen them, but not as commonly north of the Missouri River. But we definitely have reason to suspect that they will become established in the northern part of the state and even north of Missouri.
Okay, and you mentioned as far as how they cross bodies of water, which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you know, the Missouri River has traditionally been that big barrier for them,
Mm-hmm.
but they can inflate their lungs and kind of float across even big rivers.
Yes, they can.
And then smaller streams and creeks and stuff, they kind of deflate and just crawl along the bottom.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, where are they from, Randy wants to know originally?
You know, originally they're really from the Isthmus of Central America, so south of Mexico to the northern portion of South America is really where they were from hundreds of years ago and have expanded from then.
Okay, again, just fascinating. Also, what do we have?
Yeah, I got a question about armadillos. Why do they jump straight up in the air when frightened? And it's a really good point, and it's kind of an unfortunate adaptation in the modern world for our armadillos. They have a habit of, when they're frightened, and they have very poor hearing and poor eyesight, they get along mostly by smell. So you can sneak up on an armadillo fairly easily, and then when they're frightened, they will jump straight up in the air, and then when they land, they'll take off running. Well, unfortunately, they can be surprised by cars on the road, and they will jump straight up into the grill of the car. And so you'll see them as roadkill frequently, especially if you're traveling some of the major roadways, some of the major corridors through South Missouri.
Yeah, that's even popular for a lot of folks, counting the roadkill armadillo as you drive highways. Let's see, let's jump over to Darby. Brad wants to know, how long do jellyfish live?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'm not totally familiar with their two different life stages and how long they'll exist in each of those life stages. So that is an excellent question. Like I said, they have the polyp stage and they have the free swimming Medusa stage. So you know, that'd be something good to look into on our MDC website. We have all of these species actually on our field guide. Yep. on our internet.
Yes, so. And we will get to that part or right there. So folks, if you want to know more about any of these species of weird wildlife and others and all the native wildlife, visit our website at mdc.mo.gov. And at the top of our homepage, you'll see Discover Nature. Click on that, and you will find stuff from our field guide to places to go to things to do and all kind of other good info. We only have a couple minutes left, so let's see if we can get through a few questions. Can you eat eels? Jill wants to know. Darby.
Yes, actually you can. They are actually a really important source of food in Asian countries. It's just really not as important now in our country. You just don't see people eating eels as much, but they were an important source of food for Native Americans as well.
Well, good to know. So yeah, you can't eat them. Mm-hmm. as we are wrapping up, Danielle wants to know, Aaron, is it true armadillos carry leprosy, and what's up with that?
It is true. So that is a bacteria that naturally occurs on the skin of armadillo, and they were used in early research to treat leprosy, which now, of course,
Really?
yes, leprosy is easily treated with antibiotics. But armadillos were important in establishing that research
Treatment
of
for
an
leprosy.
effective treatment
So
for
they're
leprosy.
actually helping.
Mhm.
Another myth, Jill wants to know, do our 9-banded armadillos roll up into a ball?
Well, they do occasionally, but they're more likely to run as a defensive mechanism. But they will roll up into a ball to try to protect themselves as a last-ditch effort, defensive effort.
Fascinating. Thanks, folks. Aaron and Darby, thank you. We're about out of time. So again, we want to give a shout out and props to Aaron and Darby for joining us and sharing some pretty freaky facts about some pretty weird wildlife.
This was a lot of fun,
Yeah, it was
Joe.
fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us. Again, you could watch our past Wild Webcasts online. So there's the URL. There are some of the topics for you. We appreciate everything. This Wild website will also be available online for later. And final question, Bill wanted to know, paddlefish, the noses, do those help them swim? What are they for?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not really any certain idea of what they're exactly for. Some say maybe helping them orient themselves. Some say maybe a sensory organ, maybe help in reproduction, or maybe to ward off predators.
It's another mystery.
Yeah.
Another mystery to be solved. So that's it for today, folks. Thank you again for joining us. Aaron, Darby, thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Joe.
Joe.
And let's get outside and discover nature.